Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Kate. I am the editorial coordinator of 1804 Books, a community bookstore and press for socialist literature and revolutionary theory. We're based at the People's Forum in New York City. We're a movement incubator, and we have classes on books, art workshops, even a media strategy course, and we have an art space, concerts, a cafe, and everything is both virtual and in person, so we invite you to follow us on social media, even if you aren't here in New York. Tonight's event is the book talk, The Cancer of Colonialism, W. Alphaeus Hunton, Black Liberation, and the Daily Worker from 1944 to 1946. It's all about, of course, Alphaeus Hunton, a scholar activist, Pan-Africanist, and communist who led the Council on African Affairs from 1943 to 1955. This book is a short biography as well as a collection of his articles for the Daily Worker gathered here for the first time. We're excited to be here with the author Tony Pecinovsky, a journalist and organizer based in St. Louis. He's the president of the St. Louis Workers Education Society, as well as a regular contributor to People's World and the St. Louis Labor Tribune. His articles have appeared in Shelter Force, Z Magazine, Alternate, and Political Affairs. He's also the author of Let Them Tremble, biographical interventions marking 100 years of the Communist Party USA, and the author-editor of Faith in the Masses, essays celebrating 100 years of the Communist Party USA. We are also joined tonight by Timothy Johnson, a librarian and historian who studies the intersection of communism and the African American community. He is the former director of Tamiment Library and Wagner Labor Archives at NYU, and is currently the editor of the journal American Communist History. He's also the author of Malcolm X, a comprehensive annotated bibliography, and recently wrote The Forward to Decision in Africa, a book by W. Alphaeus Hunton. We are so grateful to have these organizer researchers here to speak about the important legacy of Hunton, and I remind you that you can buy the books at 1804.com as well as international publishers. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tony.
Well, thank you very much, Kate and People's Forum, for organizing this talk this evening. And thank you, Tim, for also agreeing to be a part of this discussion. My talk this evening is going to be about 20-25 minutes, and so that should leave us with plenty of time to have Tim's response and discussion, and then some Q&A afterwards. And so I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. W. Alphaeus Hunton, a Howard University professor and leader of the National Negro Congress, joined the Council on African Affairs as educational director in 1943. As an intellectual and organizational architect of what is now called the long civil rights movement, he brought with him a wealth of knowledge and experience. The Council on African Affairs is part of this long civil rights legacy. To Gerald Horne, it was the vanguard organization in the U.S. campaigning against colonialism. Penny M. von Eschen referred to it as vital and important. It provided the connective tissue that brought together African Americans struggling for equality with Africans struggling for Black liberation, particularly in apartheid South Africa. From 1943 to 1955, the CAA and its publications, New Africa and later Spotlight on Africa, were Hunton's main political outlets. Through the CAA, he engaged a larger Black radical diaspora that included Pan-Africanist, communists, union leaders, elected officials, and other progressives. A scholar activist, Hunton's journalism spanned roughly 35 years. He not only served on the editorial board of the NNC's publication, Congress View, but from July 1944 to January 1946, Hunton wrote a regular column for the Communist Party's newspaper, The Daily Worker, which, as was mentioned, is captured in this book, Cancer of Colonialism. From November 1950 until summer 1955, he contributed to Paul Robeson's newspaper Freedom, and from 1961 until his death in 1970, he was an associate editor and contributor to Freedom Ways, the quarterly journal of Black liberation. Hunton also wrote numerous speeches, press releases, and pamphlets, and in 1957 published Decision in Africa, Sources of Current Conflict. All of these documents hold value to anyone interested in the evolution of 20th century resistance to Jim Crow and colonial subjugation. Hunton's life provides a glimpse into a broader world of post-World War II McCarthy and civil rights era activism that bridges the struggles for African American equality, Black liberation, and colonial independence, struggles that were intimately linked to a world movement for socialism, what I call a red-black alliance. Central to Hunton's analysis was a rising Black militancy comfortable with red allies, that Black luminaries such as Paul Robeson and later W.E.B. Du Bois, Hunton's closest CAA co-workers, chose to align with communists despite the repression they faced, complicates our discourses on the permissible boundaries of Black civil rights. That Robeson, Du Bois, and Hunton, among others, sought and found allies internationally, particularly in the socialist camp, adds another layer of nuance, which may help working class activists today reconceptualize solidarity, internationalism, and civil rights as the assault on Black lives continues unabated. On his first day at the CAA's New York office, Hunton recalled the cross-Atlantic solidarity showed by the British working class in the fight against slavery. He told reporters, just as labor and the liberal forces of England recognized 180 years ago that their own interest lay in the overthrow of American slavery, so today it is necessary for Americans and all people of the anti-Axis world to realize that their future security and peace must ultimately depend upon the abolition of imperialism in Africa and throughout the world. Hunton came back to this theme in his daily worker columns by reminding readers that slavery in the U.S. was defeated in part with international support. Hunton articulated a strategic concept linking the struggle for equality and liberation with the ability to bring international pressure to bear. The abolitionist forces in America looked to England for help in their struggle, and they received much practical support, financial and otherwise, he wrote. As a communist, Hunton saw internationalism as a foundational requisite for both African American equality and Black liberation in Africa. Further, he saw Soviet socialism through the prism of its ideological and material support for colonial peoples, support that was evident in the young Soviet government's 1917 proclamation granting the right of self-determination to colonial peoples of the Russian Empire. This proclamation signaled that the new revolutionary government stood for the liberation of peoples subjected to direct or indirect colonial oppression. Soviet support for self-determination and national liberation was not rhetorical, as Hunton documented in his Daily Worker, New Africa, Spotlight on Africa, Freedom, and Freedom Ways articles, as well as in Decision in Africa. Additionally, Hunton recognized the special emphasis communists placed on what was called the Negro question, Soviet indictment of U.S. racism, particularly in the southern United States, stretched back to the Comintern's first Congress, but found concrete organizational form in 1922 with the creation of a Negro Bureau and the formulation of a thesis on the Negro question. This document articulated the Comintern's support of all Black liberation movements that helped to undermine imperialism. By 1928, the Comintern declared African Americans to be an oppressed nation with the right to national self-determination. Regardless of the merit of the Black Belt thesis, which was continually debated within the CPUSA, this declaration encouraged the elevation of anti-racism as a priority policy by the late 1920s and early 1930s. Coupled with the defense of the Scottsboro Nine, the organizing of the Sharecroppers Union, a turn toward Popular Front politics, and the emergence of groups like the National Negro Congress, the Southern Negro Youth Congress, as well as multiracial communist-led CIO unions, by the mid-1930s, the CPUSA had a level of respect and prestige, especially in the Black community, only dreamed of a decade earlier. Hard-won acceptance resulted in African American activists, including Alphaeus Hunton, joining the Communist Party. Hunton's perspectives on equality and liberation were seen through this prism, and he sought to popularize Soviet socialism as an ally in post-war African development. Hunton's first Daily Worker column, published in July 1944, addressed the widespread and genuine appreciation for those aspects of Soviet life which formed the basis of her national strength. To him, the way in which within a quarter of a century, many millions of people of different races, creeds, and cultures, illiterate, impoverished, and degraded victims of exploitation under the old Russian Empire were raised to full social, economic, and political equality was evidence of communism's commitment to liberation. As his Daily Worker columns indicate, Hunton was primarily concerned with how the people of Africa themselves viewed the Soviet Union. In an August 1944 column, he wrote, "With the increasing knowledge of the Soviet power, African leaders are more frequently citing the contrast between the failure of the European colonial administration and the remarkable success of the Soviet government. Success was defined as raising Soviet citizens out of a state of colonial serfdom." Hunton's use of the language of liberation is important. He is intentionally comparing colonial subjects in Africa and colonial serfs in the former Russian Empire in an effort to build solidarity between the Black and the Red. In an April 1945 column, he wrote, "Never before have the Negro and other oppressed peoples had such strong, manifold allies as today. The Soviet Union was his prime example." As Paul Robeson's biographer notes, Hunton and his CAA co-workers fused anti-colonial and pro-Soviet sentiments domestically. This was evident in Hunton's steady stream of essays and articles. Additionally, it has been argued that the CAA functioned as a press service under Hunton's leadership. In her biography of Alphaeus, Dorothy Hunton notes that he provided content and analysis to roughly 130 newspapers. Though what he wrote was often read by an international audience, Hunton nonetheless emphasized that his main responsibility was to educate and organize domestically. He recalled later in life that the CAA's prime objective was to provide a sound basis of accurate information so that the American people might play their proper part in the struggle for African freedom. The scholar activist sought to inform, agitate, and mobilize. Illustrative of how importantly Hunton saw his role as an internationalist, he proudly shared a 1944 letter sent by the secretary of the Nigerian Trade Union Congress. It said in part, To know that we have friends at the other end of the Atlantic is comforting and inspiring in our struggle for freedom from want and heartless exploitation. It was precisely these types of connections that Hunton spent his life trying to build. As World War II neared its end, Hunton and the CAA grew increasingly concerned. They mobilized to keep the colonial question in the public spotlight and not pigeonholed. African Americans and colonial peoples feared the modest gains made during the war would be reversed. To Hunton, the outcome of the 1945 San Francisco UN meeting affected not only the 750 million people in the colonies, it directly affects the future peace and prosperity of America and the world. The forces of reaction must not succeed in depriving either us or the colonial peoples of the harvest over the victory of fascism, he concluded. Unfortunately, the post-war world proved to be very different than the one Hunton and the CAA envisioned. In 1946, the CAA could partner with Broadway stars and celebrities and easily fill Madison Square Garden with 15,000 supporters. However, by 1947, U.S. Attorney General Tom Clark had labeled the council subversive. By 1950, the CAA couldn't even rent the garden. The Red Scare and Cold War sought to suffocate groups like the CAA. Illustrative of the ubiquitous repressive environment, according to the New York Times, the CAA was nothing more than a communist-controlled organization supported mainly by Negroes. This was an important acknowledgement by the newspaper of note, an acknowledgement that highlighted two convergent realities. One, the ruling class tacitly confessed that Black militancy comfortable with Red allies was a potent political force. And two, the emerging Red Scare would focus laser-like on Black-led communist organizations like the CAA and the CRC, the Civil Rights Congress, of which Hunton was a bail fund trustee. Hunton was succinct and to the point in an August 1949 letter to the Daily Worker. Not only did he defend the recently indicted CPUSA leadership, but he took aim at the enemy, white supremacy and capitalism. He wrote, "The record will show that the fight for the freedom of communists is a fight for their right to fight for the rights of Negroes." This neglected statement is profound and articulates an ideological formulation that centers the struggle for African American equality as essential to the fight for democracy. To Hunton, the role of communists was to both defend and expand democracy, especially among people of color. Unfortunately, as Charisse Burden-Stilley argues, the Cold War state apparatus responded to Hunton and those like him by weaponizing anti-communism. Like the indicted CPUSA leadership, Robeson, Du Bois, and Hunton were also punished. Robeson had his passport revoked, Du Bois was indicted as a foreign agent, Hunton was thrown in jail, along with Dashiell Hammett, for refusing to divulge the names of CRC bail fund contributors. Hunton didn't back down, though. Instead, he fought against the prevailing winds of the Cold War and Red Scare. He sought to bring the South African anti-apartheid struggle into popular consciousness, to link Red Scare domestic persecution with racialized political repression abroad, and he continued to point to Soviet socialism as an ally. For example, in April 1952, Hunton and the CAA organized 5,000 people to rally in solidarity with the ANC's campaign of defiance of unjust laws. They also picketed the South African consulate and organized a petition drive in support of the ANC with a goal of 100,000 signatures. Like the Civil Rights Congress and the International Workers' Order, among others, the CAA's continued activism challenges the dominant narrative of the demise of the communist-led left as the Red Scare intensified. In a March 1953 Freedom article, Hunton reminded readers of the oneness of the struggle of Black people in every land against racist oppression. The CAA faced continued harassment because it was the one organization in America which for more than a decade has been consistently exposing South African racism and enlisting American support for the struggles of the oppressed in that country, he added. The CAA's ongoing exposure of apartheid's racist brutality, linked with campaigns against domestic Jim Crow, had the potential to further solidify an informal alliance given substance decades earlier with the emergence of communist-led groups like the National Negro Congress and the Southern Negro Youth Congress. When Hunton likened South Africa to one gigantic concentration camp, he was also challenging the U.S. government's commitment to equality and democracy, a challenge not lost on U.S. policymakers. As Brenda Gale Plumer writes, Cold War rivalries forced the United States to confront segregation and stimulated reforms on the civil rights front. Hunton's biting critiques of apartheid and Jim Crow, amplified by his international allies, helped to force concessions on behalf of equality and liberation. After the CAA's 1955 forced dissolution, Hunton focused his considerable intellectual attention on research and writing Decision in Africa, which was published in 1957. Written 15 years before Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Hunton's book brought a Marxist analysis to the plunder of Africa while highlighting a path toward independence aided by world socialism. As Hunton argued, the peoples of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa were no longer forced to bend the knee by economic strangulation, for they now have an alternative to Western markets in the socialist sector of the world. Soviet socialism as a global competitor was a world historic event, he argued. That the socialist nations came forward and offered economic assistance to the independent peoples of Africa with trade deals and technical know-how put imperialism on its heels. Hunton added, Cold War commentators insisted that the offer of assistance itself was a threat to Africa and the free world. Hunton, however, dug deeper. As he saw it, what worries Washington is not so much the interest of the prospective recipients of Soviet aid as its own interest. World imperialism fears the weakening or loss of its exclusive control and influence. It fears giving these countries the chance to make choices and decisions of their own. To Hunton, fear of losing exclusive control coupled with racism was at the heart of the domestic Red Scare and international Cold War. The Pittsburgh Courier's review of Decision in Africa noted that the book painted a sorry picture of a continent being systematically and ruthlessly robbed. It is difficult, if not impossible, to controvert Mr. Hunton's thesis, the review concluded. By spring 1961, Decision in Africa had been published in the Soviet Union, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. That summer, Alphaeus and Dorothy Hunton were invited to the Soviet Union for a complete medical checkup. For Hunton, this was not a vacation. Radio and press interviews, university lectures, and other speaking engagements were arranged throughout Eastern Europe, further bruising Washington's already battered international reputation. That spring, reports across the world had broadcast newsreel of abused and bloodied freedom riders. Shortly after returning, Hunton received a letter from Du Bois asking him to relocate to Ghana to help with the Encyclopedia Africana, an invitation he was excited to accept. After the 1966 coup in Ghana, which ousted Kwame Nkrumah, Hunton continued to popularize Soviet support for equality and liberation from Zambia. He wrote for Freedom Ways and for the ANC Underground Bulletin until his death in 1970, which brought full circle a life committed to equality, liberation, and socialism. And I'm almost done. In 1991, as Soviet socialism was collapsing, Nelson Mandela hosted a reception for then CPUSA leaders Angela Davis and Charlene Mitchell. At that reception, the future Nobel Peace Prize recipient told his comrades, "We will never permit our enemies to tell us who our friends should be." Mandela's comment acknowledges the role of communists like Alphaeus Hunton, as well as world socialism in the downfall of apartheid, an acknowledgement likely surprising to most activists today as they look for allies in the struggle for Black lives. Alphaeus Hunton clearly saw the need for international allies in the struggle for equality and liberation. Perhaps this is a lesson worth studying. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tony. It's really exciting to see your book in motion from the editor itself. So I'll pass it over to Tim for responses.
Yeah, well, I think that Tony's book is a welcome contribution to kind of the excavation of the history that's been ignored for a long time, and particularly the history of the communist movement, African Americans in the communist movement, and their role in the anti-colonial struggle. And in the book, it's largely divided into the three areas. And the introduction deals with the role of the Communist Party and the development of the ideological position of the Communist Party, which kind of created the background or led to Alphaeus Hunton's activities. Second part is a biography of Alphaeus Hunton, which is important because not much is known about him, although people who would have been active in that time period would know the name. Some 50 or so years later, most people are not familiar with him at all. And it goes into detail about his activities in the National Negro Congress, his activities on the Committee on Africa with Robeson, and then later on his work in Africa. And then finally, there's the columns themselves, which kind of give a look at an intellectual who's analyzing a historical process as it's unfolding in front of him, which is the colonization, decolonization, the beginnings of decolonization in Africa. And those actually a good companion to the book is Hunton's own book, which was also reissued by International last year, called Decisions in Africa, which Tony referred to. And in that book, it's much more of a scholarly book covering the political history and the economy and development of African countries and analyzing the exploitation by imperialism of those countries, and then suggesting ways that those countries can achieve decolonization and independence, and urging them to develop on a non-capitalist path with reliance on the Soviet bloc. But in any case, all three of these, the introduction, the Hunton bio, and the columns in that were taken from the Daily Worker, all three of them together give an illustration of what some historians have referred to as the Anti-Colonial Front, or other historians have referred to as the Black International. And this is something that goes back to the early 1900s, and organizations like the League Against Imperialism, which had two meetings, one in Brussels in 1927 and one in Frankfurt in 1929, in which African-American communists were active participants in. And then the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, which is led by George Padmore, which is also supported by communists, with a lot of African-Americans involved. And the other thing that's interesting in it is that many of these, well, actually the columns ended, I think, in the late 1940s. But then, as you'll see in the short biography of him, as the McCarthy period set in, and as Tony mentioned, that Hunton was imprisoned for some time for his refusal to hand over donor lists from the Civil Rights Congress. And then he ended up in various countries in Africa, finally ending in Ghana, and then thrown out of Ghana when Nkrumah was overthrown. But in his activities and the people that he came in contact with, you see the development in the context of the anti-communist hysteria that was going on in this country. You see the development and the growth of this anti-colonial front, or kind of Black internationalism. And also, for those who are old enough to remember the 1980s, which may not be everybody, and the Free South Africa movement, you can see the beginnings of the development of what guided the Free South Africa movement in the works of people like Alphaeus Hunton and his co-workers on the Committee in Africa. So that's pretty much it. It's a worthwhile book. As I said, it helps to uncover a part of history that's not well known in terms of the internationalist aspect of the broader African-American movement. Much of the African-American movement is focused on domestic scene, but there was a strong international branch of it from certainly from the 1900s or the 19th century on up to the current period. And I think this book does a good example of examining that story through the eyes and the intellectual work and organizational work of one man.
Thanks so much. I'll ask if Tony has any comments that he wants to say before we move on to questions.
Yeah, just a few things, and thank you, Tim. Just a few things to kind of add to or piggyback off of Tim's comments. First is, it was, I guess, July of 1951 when Alphaeus was thrown in prison for 6 months for refusing to divulge the names of the Civil Rights Congress bail fund, and served 6 months in prison. And the photo that graces the cover of the book is actually the photo that was taken of Hunton, Robeson, Du Bois, and Dorothy Hunton at LaGuardia Airport in mid-December, when he was released and was able to rejoin his comrades. And so I really felt like that was an important moment in history to capture, of this very principled and very honorable, comradely stance against the racist, oppressive apparatus of the state, that had been hounding communists and the broad movements that communists were in the leadership of at the time. And if their goal had been to isolate Du Bois and Robeson and Hunton, that goal was an abject failure, because also in December of 1951 was the release of the CRC's historic petition, We Charge Genocide, in the UN headquarters in New York and Paris, simultaneously by Robeson and William L. Patterson. And then shortly after Hunton's release from prison, he's speaking in front of thousands of union members who give him a standing ovation when he, calls for support from all of these union members to endorse and to take to their unions calls for endorsement of the genocide petition. And then the CAA and the Civil Rights Congress together, march down Harlem, demanding an end to, genocide against African Americans and an end to colonial oppression. And so this attempt to isolate Hunton and Robeson and Du Bois and this broad network of red-black activism, red-black alliance, was an abject failure. And I wanted to mention that and also draw attention to this photo that was on the cover, because this was the point where Hunton rejoined his comrades, and that this attempt to isolate him was very clearly a failure by the U.S. Government's racist repressive apparatus. And one other thing that I wanted to note is, and I didn't have the opportunity to go into much detail, and maybe a future longer biography of Hunton, I'll be able to do this. But one of the, if I'm being self-critical, one of the weaknesses of the book is that I don't spend much time on Alphaeus's personal life, on his familial life with his wife, Dorothy. It's largely a political biography, but I do want to note the deep care and love that Dorothy and Alphaeus had for each other, and that these were deeply passionate people who cared not only for the world and for other people and for their comrades, and wanted to see a world of socialism, but they also cared very deeply for each other. And after Alphaeus's passing, Dorothy writes to Esther Cooper Jackson and says that, Africa without dear Alphaeus is no longer home for me. I'll be coming back to New York soon. And I just think that was a very heartwarming, heart-wrenching kind of moment that was captured. And so maybe in a future project, I'll be able to capture more of the more intimate side of Alphaeus and Dorothy Hunton that maybe has been neglected by myself and by other historians. And we want to make sure that we capture the humanity of communists, not just their political activism, but also their humanity. So I wanted to add that as well.
Thanks so much. I was going to say myself, I was also curious about the personal life, because I know that you noted that it was a political biography in the book itself. So it's very, like you said, heartwarming to hear about his life and his relationships to other people, just because, we are all humans who are organizing for other humans. So that's always a wonderful thing to note.
The other thing that comes out in the book is the long history of anti-imperialist sentiment in the African American community. And it certainly goes back further, but just in terms of kind of the immediate thing is the African Blood Brotherhood, who encompassed some of the early African Americans that ended up joining the Communist Party. And at that time, at the very beginnings of the Communist Party, for a lot of reasons, go into some other time, they hadn't really developed a position on African Americans, as Tony kind of spells out in the introduction of his book. But what attracted these people from the African Blood Brotherhood was largely the Soviet Union and the Soviet Communist Party, because they stood so strongly in opposition to racism and in opposition to colonialism. And those kinds of trends, like you talk about Patterson and the We Charge Genocide, bringing the case before the United Nations. And then about 20 years later, Malcolm X does the same thing. So there's all these, like I said, historians often refer to it as Black internationalism, quote unquote, that's always in the context of the communist movement, or mostly in the context of the communist movement, that it takes life, has been a consistent presence in the African American community. And again, I go back to the large demonstrations against apartheid in the United States in the 1980s, and the kind of celebration that happened when Mandela was released from prison. I mean, you walk through Harlem, and nobody was in the streets. Everybody was home or in a bar watching the television when Mandela got released. And so that kind of internationalist consciousness is spread not just to Africa, but to colonized countries in Asia and elsewhere. I mean, there's a long history of Ho Chi Minh's connections to the African American community when he lived in New York for a while. But I think that's another element that comes out strongly in the work of Hunt and his comrades in various organizations.
Thank you. Additions. I guess at this point, I invite everyone who's been watching to put your questions in the chat. It's been a very lively one, so we're always grateful for that. So yeah, if you have any questions, we'd be glad to highlight them and answer them here. And it's a very good opportunity to ask, so I encourage you to. I guess to start off, where do I start? I would think I'll start from the beginning, I guess. I'm curious about how, Tony, you found yourself writing this book. You found your way to Alphaeus, excuse me. And, maybe Tim as well, you can speak to how you learned about him, because I think you were talking about it before, how he's not the most prominent activist, or because of, there's a lack of information about him, which this book, seeks to fill a gap on. So I'm curious about how you for yourself, and what motivated you both to work around his work.
Well, so I guess I have been curious about the lives of communists for the past 20 plus years, primarily Black communists. My mentors from my teenage years have mostly been Black communists here in St. Louis, and I grew up reading the biographies of a number of Black communists, Henry Winston, Claude Lightfoot, Angela Davis, those types of folks, as well as Gerald Horne's wonderful biographies of William Patterson and Benjamin Davis Jr. And those books led me to a number of other books about the links between the African American struggle for equality and the struggle for colonial independence in Africa. And in all of these books, I would see Alphaeus mentioned. He would be mentioned occasionally when the Council on African Affairs was brought up. He would be mentioned. And so I just got really curious. Well, who is this Alphaeus Hunton, and why is he continually mentioned, but there doesn't seem to be a book-length study of his life and his contributions? And then I read some more books about the National Negro Congress. Death Blow to Jim Crow was one of the books I read, and other books. But again, Alphaeus was mentioned, a very prominent figure in the Washington, D.C. area NNC, and again, he's just kind of mentioned, and I was very curious why he was just mentioned. And so I looked and I looked and I read and I read, and I just could not find anywhere a book length or any sort of scholarly analysis of Alphaeus's life. And so I felt like no one else had done it, and I didn't see any prospects for anybody else doing it. And so I just decided I had to. And it actually came out of a project as we were nearing the 100th anniversary of the birth of the Communist Party in 2019, was working on another book, Let Them Tremble, and I wanted to highlight the lives of 6 prominent leaders of the Communist Party: Arnold Johnson, Charlene Mitchell, Henry Winston, Gus Hall, Judith LeBlanc, and W. Alphaeus Hunton. And so the other 5, I think, were more well known. And Alphaeus, he had really I was really interested in his life, and so I wanted to include Alphaeus in that collection. And then I moved on to some other projects, and the Faith in the Masses collection of essays. And then I wanted to come back to Alphaeus's life and really study deeply these columns from the Daily Worker, study more deeply his articles in Freedom and Freedom Ways, and as well as the Spotlight on Africa and the newsletters of the CAA, and so I just felt like this had to be a book that no one else had really devoted a book-length study of Alphaeus's life, and I just felt compelled to do it. It's such an amazing life that had been neglected, I think in part because he was overshadowed by Robeson and Du Bois, no fault of theirs. The historians have focused on Du Bois and Robeson quite a bit, and Hunton had just been overshadowed, I think, in some ways. He had also been overshadowed, as Penny M. von Eschen argues, partly because he was a well-known communist, and there's still, as some folks within the Organization of American Historians have argued, a red taboo within the historiography of the United States. And so, anyways, I felt compelled, and I plan on doing more work on Alphaeus if time and travel allows. So.
Excellent. Thank you. I mean, it does seem like, as you said, Alphaeus is largely alluded to or just briefly mentioned. And I mean, I was also going to show the cover of the book as well. And, of course, there are these 2 monuments of the Black communist struggle alongside, of course, Alphaeus. And I guess I wonder if either of you have any thoughts on why he is usually only noted, or why he hasn't gotten as much attention. Of course, as you have said before our talk and other conversations, I know that it's not, of course, through any fault of Robeson or Du Bois, but why hasn't he gained the same audience? Of course, maybe we can't all have that level of attention paid to, but
Well, I think one of the things is the kind of anti-communist McCarthyite hysteria from the 50s on has really damaged intellectual production in this country.
Yeah.
Only within maybe the last 20 years or so that you could write something about a Hunton or something about or an objective history of the Communist Party and then expect to get a teaching job, which is, of course, why most people do a PhD and write a book. So there's like thousands of stories that can be told that really haven't been written on. But recently, because of the laxing of the kind of hysterical anti-communism, you see more and more younger historians who are beginning to take these subjects up. One article I wrote in a journal had to do with the organizing of sharecroppers in Alabama in the 1930s. And other than being a section of Robert Kelly's book on the Alabama Communist Party, the Communist Party of Alabama, there'd been almost nothing written on it. And there was tons of primary source material written in located Communist Party's archives, detailing reports from the field, going back to New York, what they were doing. And they had literally 7,000 member sharecroppers union in Alabama in the 1930s. It's not clear how many of them were actually communists, because people, sharecroppers, when they joined the sharecroppers union, most of them assumed they were joining the Communist Party at the same time because they didn't see any distinction between them. And they had a youth section and a women's section, and it's very well organized. Uh, a lot of repression, as you might imagine, in 1930s Alabama, but still nobody. One scholar did write a book that just came out recently on the Communist Party in Alabama, but in all of that time, no one had gone through any of these sources. There's just a gigantic void. There's probably dozens of people like Hunton who may have been known in the 30s and the 40s, but history is kind of forgot because historians have not kept their story alive by telling that story.
Yep. Absolutely. I would agree with that 100%.
Great. That's very illuminating for all of us. I guess there's a question about secret speech. I don't know if you saw it on the side, but it says on page 165, you discussed the lack of impact the secret speech had on some of the African American communists, and asked for elaboration on it from David Bally. I don't know if you remember page 165.
Well, I mean, I think, as others have written, African American Party members were, less susceptible to anti-communism, more aware of the genesis of capitalism. Being the capitalism was literally born on the backs of the African slave trade and the genocide of the Native American peoples, and they were also acutely more aware of the need for international allies. And so I think that in general, most African American members of the party at that time saw the revelations of Stalin's crimes against the Soviet people as a renewal, as a replenishment, as a opportunity to right the ship in a way. At least that's my interpretation of how Alphaeus and how Paul Robeson and others saw the speech. Of course, Hunton's friend and fellow Howard professor Doxy Wilkerson, who became a educational director of the Communist Party in Maryland, I think, left the party at that time, and so it wasn't unanimous. It wasn't across the board, but by and large, there was a sentiment among many African American leaders of the party at that time, that this was an opportunity to right the ship, to a renewal, and also acknowledging that the crimes of Stalin do not invalidate socialism, do not invalidate the idea of socialism. And so that was my takeaway, though. That was the way I thought about it, and that's the way that I interpreted what I read from Alphaeus and from others. Maybe Tim has some insight to this as well.
Yeah, I'm reminded, and actually I just read it today, and I can't remember where I read it. That's the Ravages of Age. Reading something by Esther Jackson. Esther Jackson was a leader of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, was a member of the Communist Party. Her husband was a leading member of the Communist Party for years. And someone was asking her basically that kind of question. And Esther's response was something like, well, we didn't join this party because of Stalin and then the Soviet Union. We respect Stalin, we love what the Soviet Union has done, but we joined the Communist Party because the Communist Party offered the clearest resolution to what would be a solution to the problems that we face in this country.
Yeah.
So that's not to say that when they found out some not so kosher thing Stalin had done, that they agreed with them. It's just that wasn't what drove them to the party. So that wasn't what was going to drive them out. of the party either.
Absolutely.
The thing is, I've heard people say, well, someone would ask you, how could you stay in the party when Stalin has done X, Y, and Z? Well, how would you expect someone to salute your flag when most of the people who created this country were slave owners in terms of the Continental Congress and all of that, or condoned slavery, or certainly if they weren't slave owners, certainly were racist and did not see the equality in people. So if that didn't run you out of this country, why would you be run away from an organization because of mistakes by somebody who's not even in the organization you're in?
Yeah.
So I think there's a big difference in terms of how people interpreted that. Again, it's not to say that people were giving Stalin a pass, as if just to say that's really not why I'm in this party. I'm in this party because I see this party fighting against racism, fighting against unemployment, etc. All of the things that the Communist Party has been active in for years.
Yep.
Thank you for your insight. I guess in that vein, you mentioned it a bit at the end of your presentation, Tony, but how do we take Alphaeus's lessons and legacies into the context of today? Of course, the last 2 years in the pandemic, we saw a rise in a special attention to the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'm sure that their legacies are woven through that, and the work of Alphaeus and his comrades made that possible. But I guess, how do you apply his perspective to the discourse that occurs in general politics now, and sorry, I got distracted by the comments. General politics now, and because it's a largely domestic conversation. I'd say it's mostly about America, and it's internal, each to their own countries, where they're protesting police brutality and prisons. So I guess, how do you understand it? How has that maybe changed? How has learning about Alphaeus changed the movement work today? Both of those questions.
Well, I think first and foremost, we should think about Alphaeus's contribution as an internationalist, and he very clearly made the links between equality and liberation as an internationalist. And I think that is something that activists today should ponder and think about, is how do we make the links between Black Lives Matter domestically and its counterparts throughout the world. Of course, the objective political situation is different today than what it was during Alphaeus's time. The Communist Party was, in many ways, the left center. Was the center of the left at that time. It had a world power that was able to bring international pressure to bear for African American equality, and wasn't shy about arguing and bringing attention to the horrendous abuses inflicted upon African Americans, as well as Black South Africans, for example, which the CAA was one of the main focuses, was in apartheid South Africa. And so I think those links, if possible, should be made between Black Lives Matter and other international movements to try to bring international pressure to bear against police misconduct and violence today. Context is a little bit different, but it's still an absolutely necessary component. And I think every activist, and especially every Marxist and communist, has to think internationally if we are to fight the ravages of police violence and more generally capitalism.
Thanks so much, Tony. Someone asked, an ebook or plan?
I didn't catch that.
Oh, sorry. I was saying there's questions if there's an ebook or plan.
Currently, there is not an ebook. There is plans for one. The other two books, Let Them Tremble and Faith in the Masses, are both ebooks. And I think sometime in the next 6 months, The Cancer of Colonialism will be an ebook. We've just got to figure it out.
Great. In that vein, I guess I would like to also ask what's next for both of you. Perhaps Tim is just enjoying retirement, but if there's anything else you'd like to add before we close out, and of course, everyone, if you have final questions, feel free to put them in the comments. I know that I've been chattering away.
No, I mean, I would just reiterate what I said. I think Tony's book is well worth reading if people want to get kind of a historical sense of the development of the anti-imperial, at least one aspect of the anti-imperialist movement in the United States. This gives you a good feel with it. And again, when you read the columns, they're dated, obviously, historically, because they're mostly written in the 40s. But what you see is someone who didn't have access to CNN and all the kinds of information we have now, but he was largely reacting on news reports, and he's theorizing about how to combat imperialism, how to combat colonialism, how can these countries that have been oppressed by the European capitalist countries for hundreds of years maintain their freedoms, and what does freedom mean? You see him wrestling with those kinds of questions in real time. And then when you read them, kind of knowing how the whole story plays out, it's very interesting in terms of how much he got right, in terms of in relation to his suggestions about what kind of economy to build in these former colonies. And in essence, saying that if you ally yourselves or lend yourselves to the capitalist development, you're going to end up under the heels of the capitalism and not ever be independent. And that's effectively what you've seen through most of the underdeveloped world down to today, with the few exceptions like Cuba, Vietnam, and a few others.
Well, as for future projects, at some point when it's better to travel, I would like to spend quite a bit more time at Tamiment and Schaumburg, and hopefully do a project on the selected correspondences of Alphaeus Hunton, you know, as one of the key intellectual and organizational architects of the long civil rights movement. Alphaeus corresponded with many of the domestic and international leaders of the movement for equality and liberation. And so I would like to do some sort of book on Alphaeus's correspondences. Currently, I'm thinking about percolating a book dealing with this rise of populist fascism and the emergence or coalescence of the right-wing militia groups and conspiracy theories, and how dangerous, how absurdly dangerous. I've been using this term, dangerous absurdity, lately, and so I think this is a proper description, is the dangerous absurdity when conspiracy theorists take over school boards, and when conspiracy theorists storm state capitals and the national capital as well. How dangerous that is, but also how absurd some of their ideas are. And I think about the school board hearings about masks in schools, and just how that's God's perfect breathing apparatus and that nonsense, that people, you know what I'm talking about, right? And so it's just crazy, and it's absurd. And so this term, dangerous absurdity, I really want to dive into and analyze and maybe turn into a larger project, and this kind of coalescence of right-wing conspiracy theories and militia groups, and go from there. So.
Amazing. Of Tony and Tim. I just want to point everyone else the original book, The Cancer of Colonialism, that really does shine a really important light on the cancer that is colonialism. The roots has the connection between our domestic struggles and the ones abroad, and how important and central anti-imperialism fights are to our whole liberation. And so, yeah, Alphaeus is a great example of that, a great person to study. And someone asked in the comments, Cobb Fan asks, I know nothing of Hunton and the book. Can it be purchased online? It can be purchased. You can buy it at 1804books.com, and of course at International Publishers, the place that published the book itself, and our partners in publishing. I guess if there are no final words, no final questions, I just want to say a big thank you again to Tony and Tim for joining us. We were so excited to have you for this conversation, and it feels like it's, again, filling a huge gap in our knowledge about past struggles and past connections between the Black liberation movement and international struggles everywhere. And again, highlighting the very important in our struggle for human life. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having us and having me, and I really appreciate it, and I look forward to visiting.
Of course, sometime soon. You too, Tim.
Okay, take care.
You, bye.